Good morning, world history. This is Mr. Smith, and today we're going to be talking about Mohandas Gandhi and the fight for Indian independence. This lecture is going to be a combination of the history of Indian independence alongside Gandhi's life. Gandhi is the most important figure in the fight for Indian independence. So the two topics are really sort of attached at the hip. Let's jump in by talking a little bit about some background. The background that is really relevant to this talk is really understanding that the British had made India its so-called jewel of the crown going all the way back to the early 1800s. And after the Sepoy Rebellion, sorry, you can hear your school bell. After the Sepoy Rebellion, the Indians had no way of fighting against British rule in India. And so the British were able to set up the Raj, which was essentially British government in India. And all of the positions in that government were held by British people. It was a model of democracy in some sense, in that the British Raj was sort of like a traditional parliamentary system. And yet, the fact that Indian people couldn't partake in it meant that it was also extremely discriminatory. A lot of Indians believed that if they set up a democratic or republican system of government, or a parliamentary system of government, that was capable of replacing the British Raj, then the British would allow them to do that. The British had convinced them that Indian culture was somehow less than British culture, and British culture was superior. We know that that is, of course, in keeping with these imperialistic attitudes, social Darwinistic attitudes, this idea that the British people were superior. So over time, several Indians worked to develop what was called the All India Congress, which was basically a group of Indians who voted and elected each other and sat around talking about major political issues in India, and yet had almost no power at all. And yet the point of it was to have a model replacement for the British Raj when the British decided to leave, and to sort of show the British what the Indians had learned from their system of government. Gandhi was born into this country that was deeply controlled by the British, and a country that really did believe to some degree that British culture, sorry, we're going to let that go by, that British culture was superior to Indian culture. Gandhi, raised as in the Brahmin caste, which is the highest caste in Indian society, was raised to be a lawyer. Well, as a lawyer, whose laws do you think he's going to enforce, teach, learn, and practice? He's going to practice British law. And so when you look at these pictures, you can see a young Gandhi dressed in a British suit and tie in the center. His wife is over there on the right. He actually married her at the age of 13, which was pretty customary in India at the time. And he would actually get his education in India and England, and then he would eventually set up a law practice in South Africa. South Africa is a long way from India. It might seem really strange that he would set up his law practice in South Africa. But in fact, Gandhi, as a young man, believed that all places within the British Empire would be privileged to have British law. He really believed in the British system and British law. And so when he went down into South Africa, he thought that, he was going to set up a law practice, and the laws would be the same as they are in Britain, and the same as they are in India, and the same as they are in South Africa, because it was all part of the British Empire. Well, of course, in South Africa, he discovered that there was an incredible amount of prejudice and racism towards South Africans and Indians. A large population of Indians had been brought from India into South Africa to mine, and to engage in all sorts of mining activities, whether it's gold, which was a major mining commodity that was mined in South Africa. And so what he found himself doing was actually taking on both Indian and to a lesser extent South African clients who had been hurt in some way, shape, or form by prejudice. And he thought that he could create a system, or he could beat the system by basically using British law and showing that these are, people who have the same rights as everyone else. Increasingly over time, it became obvious that traditional courts and things weren't going to work. And so he began to develop tactics here that would lead to large-scale protests, peaceful protests. He really believed in peaceful protests. Those protests would oftentimes turn violent as British authorities would turn on the population and beat them. It's here in this sort of crucible of South Africa where he's beset on all sides by incredible poverty and incredible prejudice for both Indians and South Africans. A very, very, very deep social Darwinistic prejudice that he really begins to sort of like go back to his Indian and Hindu roots and sort of begin to move away from this idea of sort of cherishing British law. He wants to continue to use British law, but he's also beginning to realize that in the roots of Hinduism and in the roots of India, there is a long history of teachers called gurus who teach in ashrams, which are schools, and they teach concepts like nonviolence, vegetarianism, all of which are designed to do no harm to the world around you. These are concepts that had been very much present throughout Indian and Hindu culture for thousands of years. When war breaks out in South Africa between the Dutch farmers and the British government, he actually joins on the side of the British. He doesn't fight in the war, but he actually organizes an ambulance corps. So there is still this connection in which he believes that the British system is the better system. By 1906, he's begun developing his own ashram. Let me be clear about this. An ashram is a school where he's going to teach certain concepts. The most important concepts are concepts such as Ahimsa, which means nonviolence. Satyagraha, which is a really sort of an interesting concept. You might translate it as soul force, but it's really like when you know something to be true, you can rest on that and find firmness in that. And you should be willing to take blows for that because you're standing on the side of truth. So Satyagraha is a core value for Gandhi's nonviolent campaigns, especially when they walk into and face people who are going to hit them and beat them, and they're going to stand on the side of justice in the face of injustice. Satyagraha is a key component of that. Now, of course, in order to have that firmness of truth, that satyagraha, and in order to remain nonviolent in the face of violence, you have to have something else that is not talked about on this slide, but is just as important, and it's this concept called Swaraj. Swaraj is a concept that basically means, I'll write it here, self-discipline. Self-discipline. And of course, self-discipline means the ability to control oneself. So, if you want to fight for the truth of something non-violently, and yet there are people who are acting violently towards you. If you want to fight for the truth of something non-violently, and there are people acting violently towards you, then you need Swaraj, self-control, in order to keep yourself from responding violently, to maintain that nonviolence. And in doing so, you will reveal to those around you the truth of your cause and the injustice of those who are causing harm to you. Gandhi would argue that the moment you raise your hand back, the moment you become violent, people stop seeing the injustice of the oppressor, and they stop seeing your truth. So the Ahimsa component, the nonviolent component, is an incredibly important component in teaching and getting to the truth. These would work relatively well in South Africa. Gandhi did manage to change some laws in South Africa, but he would eventually come back at the beginning of World War I to India itself. And in 1914, he would spend a portion of the war traveling. He actually said that he supported the British war, which is really kind of interesting for a guy who's developing these nonviolent ideas to say he then, supports the war. But when that war was over, he immediately began these non-cooperation campaigns. These non-cooperation campaigns against the British government, where the Indian people would refuse to cooperate with British laws, British rules, and things like that. Those non-cooperation campaigns would result in things like the Indian people, and you can see it here in this image, the Indian people choosing to make their own cloth, for example. There was a British law, as crazy as it sounds, that said that only British manufacturers could make cloth. So to make your own clothing was to break the law in India. And that's exactly what Gandhi did. He broke the law by making clothing. Then, of course, he would get arrested for that sort of thing. And in getting arrested for that sort of thing, people would see the injustice of the British government in making laws that are really, really quite, that feel arbitrary, but they're not entirely arbitrary. Those laws are designed to enrich the British, specifically and especially British industrial cloth makers and the textile industry back in England. Those non-violent, non-cooperation campaigns became extremely powerful throughout India. There's a few times where the people would become violent, and this led the British to increasing their military presence throughout many parts of India. And one particular example in which this got out of hand is the Amritsar massacre of 1919. Gandhi had planned for a day of prayer and fasting, where the Indian people would do nothing but pray and fast. To fast means to not eat anything. And there would be several of his Satyagrahis, his followers, who would go to different cities in different parts of India, and they would preach Ahimsa, or nonviolence, and they would preach Swaraj, and the people would just sit and listen. Well, in the city of Amritsar, in this exact location right here, a very large group of thousands of Indians with men and women and their children came to listen to one of Gandhi's Satyagrahi. And a British general by the name of General Dwyer had told them not to assemble in this place. They assembled anyway. They did so peacefully. So he actually brought in a group of soldiers who then opened fired on the crowd. So this was a group of peaceful protesters that were massacred by this general. And it raised global awareness. It raised global awareness to the issues that Gandhi was facing in India. And of course, that global awareness is really central to Gandhi's campaign. He understood that unless the world was paying attention, people weren't really nothing was going to change. He understood that in a modern world in the 20th century, even in the 1930s, that if you filmed things, that if you wrote newspapers, and he had a newspaper that he had started, and he wrote all sorts of things, he published books, he understood that in order to get that world sympathy for his cause, he had to be in the media. So as a guy who understands that for this to work, there has to be a media component. And so the bigger splash that you can make in the media and the bigger sort of like thing you can do, the more people find out about it. So a good example of this is the 1930 Salt March. The 1930 Salt March was something that he had planned for years in advance, where he was going to walk 200 miles to the coastline and then go to the coastline and just make salt. How do you make salt from the coast? You go to the ocean, you take a palm leaf, you dip it in the water, you let that water evaporate, and when the water evaporates, you're left with salt, and you make salt. This was something that the poorest people in India had been doing for generations, so that they would have something to sell, so that, this was generally considered something that the poorest people in India did in order to make a living. Salt sellers, almost by definition, were people who lived in poverty. But the British government had made a law, once again, that outlawed the manufacture of salt. And this was because they wanted to have a monopoly on salt. They believed that controlling salt meant that they would control the population. Because in a highly humid climate like India, where you sweat profusely, you need a higher intake of salt, or you die. salt is essential for all life. And so they felt as though the controlling salt mines and controlling the manufacture of salt meant that they could control the Indian people. And so in a sense, Gandhi saw this act of civil disobedience, which means to break an unjust law. He saw this act of civil disobedience as a form of Indian independence. Because if salt is supposed to control the Indian people, then to make salt is to declare that no one controls you but yourself. And of course, this was central to the concept of Swaraj. And it's in the Salt March that we can see the two things connected. The realization that Swaraj isn't one thing, but two. Swaraj is, on the one hand, the independence of India, the self-rule of India, but it's also the self-rule of yourself. And so this was the dual concept that Swaraj gave the Indian people and that Gandhi gave to the Indian people. The idea that once you control yourself, then your nation will rule itself. So Gandhi was this big believer that the Indian independence movement actually needed to be rooted in you controlling yourself. And if you could control yourself, then India could gain independence. And if all people in India worked together as people who were in control, then there was nothing the British government could do. And in fact, the Salt March worked incredibly well. The British had to change laws. They arrested hundreds of Gandhi's followers, and the prisons literally filled up with people, including Gandhi, whom they had arrested. The British tried to provoke riots, and yet the people never fought. You can see that all of these followers are using white cloth. They're wearing white cloth, so they're continuing to not buy British-made cloth. And so the whole of India is basically refusing to give in to these British imperialist laws. And so it's sort of demonstrating that the Indian people are in control, not the British. It's fascinating. Gandhi tried to extend his movement to the Indian people themselves. He suggested that Hinduism, which was the religion that he was born into, also had a lot of problems. It wasn't just that the British system had problems. It's that Indians and Hindus had problems as well. In particular, he tried to point out that the rigid caste system that created a great deal of inequality in India, that existed before the British ever arrived. Routinely, the Indian people mistreated the lowest caste or untouchables. In fact, they refused to touch them. It's one of the reasons why they called them untouchables. If you were born an outcast, you couldn't own property. So Gandhi called these outcasts, these untouchables, children of God, and he brought them into his ashram in India, his school. He educated them, and he wanted to really give them all the same opportunities that he gave everybody else. There was a lot of pushback from Hindus when this began. And in fact, you can start to see right around 1934 that this is starting to cause a little bit of division in India, in the sense that you have traditional Hindus who really, really, really don't like Gandhi telling people that they need to change themselves as well and change their religion. Because, Hinduism is a 4,000-year-old religion. It really, truly is. That sounds like I just made that number up, but it's true. Hinduism is a 4,000-year-old religion. In 1939, as the British ramped up for World War II, Gandhi decided to do the opposite of what he did when World War I was occurring. He refused to support the war, and in fact decided to try and take advantage of the war to get the British to give up India. He called this the Quit India campaign. And he hoped that the British having to sort of use resources in Europe would prevent them from being able to use those resources in India, which would give them an opportunity to become independent. What ended up happening is that Gandhi was arrested, he was thrown in jail and imprisoned for the duration of the war. And not only that, but a new group popped up called the Muslim League. The Muslim League saw that this was their opportunity to sort of gain more rights and opportunities for Muslims in India. And by the way, let's be clear, at this time there was approximately 350 million Hindus to about 100 million Muslims. So Islam was really the minority in this population. And they knew they were a minority, and they felt as though if Gandhi was successful in creating an independent India, it would be dominated by Hindus. They may have been right. It's hard to say. But what the Muslims decided to do, the Muslim League, is they decided to support the British war, go along with the British, do what the British wanted, and in doing so, they began calling also for partition. So a partition means to separate or divide. And so they wanted to create in India their own Muslim country. When Gandhi was released from prison and World War II was over, he immediately started calling and saying, no partition. We cannot divide Hindus and Muslims. Hindus and Muslims must learn to control themselves and learn to live with each other. But people like Jawaharlal Nehru, right here, who would become the first prime minister of a free and independent India, who was also a loyal follower of Gandhi, Nehru believed that if they did not divide the Muslims and the Hindus, it would cause a civil war. Gandhi spoke out against this and said, look, if you have Swaraj, if you have self-control, you don't just use it against the British, you use it for each other as well, to control each other and to prevent each other from fighting wars against each other. So Gandhi really believed that they should not divide the nation into a Muslim and a Hindu partition. And other people, like the Muslim League, and the leader of the Muslim League, whose name was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and then, of course, Nehru here, this is Nehru, who was the leader of the Congress Party, believed that they should separate it. So, in some sense, you could make the argument that this is where Gandhi's failure starts to occur. Because in 1947, they set up two countries, and you can see the partition right here. This entire thing right here, this entire thing used to be part of British-controlled India. And they decided to partition this into a Muslim Pakistan. And in fact, this is called West Pakistan here. And then they decided to take this portion here. They decided to take this portion here and divide this up here and turn this into East Pakistan. So the country of Pakistan would actually be in East and West Pakistan, which was one united country that was actually on two opposite sides of the central country of India. Never before in the history of the world has a country been in two different places at the same time, which is completely crazy if you think about it. But that's where the Muslim majority was. The Muslim majority was in this area and in this area, so they decided to partition it in those areas. Now, as immediately after gaining independence, one of the things that's going to happen is the Muslim populations in India here are going to start feeling like they're forced to move here or here, because they're basically being told this is not India is now not a Muslim country. It's a Hindu country, right? And this is a Muslim country. So if you're a Muslim, you have to leave India. You didn't actually have to, but people felt very strongly that way. And in fact, neighbors and things like that, people would turn on each other. And if you were the one Muslim in the region, they would like ransack your house and kick you out and things like that. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of, fear that there was going to be reprisals. Then on top of that, if you were a Hindu and you lived here, you felt again that you had to leave your ancestral home and move here. And in some cases, you could have lived in that home and owned that land for generation after generation, and you have to uproot everything. Indians had a tendency to have really large families and live in the same place for a really long time. So grandma and grandpa and great grandpa and like all the kids and everybody gets uprooted and then sent across these borders. And right along these borders, you could imagine you have this sort of refugee crisis all along these borders here and here. You now have millions of people crossing those borders, millions of people. You've got Muslims going into Muslim territory. You've got Hindus going into Hindu territory. And as they come across each other, they start blaming each other for the fact that they've lost all of these things. And this immediately erupts into complete violence and chaos. It literally, you can't call it a civil war anymore because they're two countries. So what it is now is it's just all out war where the Pakistani, Muslims are now fighting the, Hindu Indians. And because this violence erupts, it not only erupts on those borders, but in major cities like Calcutta and Madras, which are major cities, Bombay, Bangalore, Calcutta is right here. This is the largest city in India and one of the largest cities in the world. It becomes just incredibly violent. And people are murdering each other in the streets on a nightly basis, Hindus and Muslims fighting each other. So Gandhi decides that he's going to engage in one last fast, in one last protest. And he does not believe that his fast and protest will end the violence, but he does believe that it will lead to his death. So Gandhi actually plans to fast, to stop eating until he dies. And the hope is that in his death, the Indians, both in India and the Muslims in Pakistan, will stop fighting. Gandhi does almost die, but miraculously, even as these people are moving across these borders and in some cases dying as a result of that movement, you can kind of see in these pictures all of the people moving across those borders. And you can see the rest of the world is like, okay, you give India independence and immediately it starts killing itself, right? That's absolutely what happened. So, this fast until death actually worked. The violence actually stopped. So Gandhi, by fasting, by not eating, actually stopped a full-scale war and civil war between Hindus and Muslims in India and Pakistan. Probably one of the greatest feats of like a single person in history. It's just incomparable in the history of world events. This idea that someone would be so popular amongst people in India and Pakistan that when he decides to die by fasting, that they would rather stop fighting each other and stop fighting these wars than see him die. And then the very next year, he's assassinated. He's assassinated by this gentleman here, Nathuram Godse, who you would think was a Muslim because, you know, you'd think that Muslims didn't like him. But in fact, Nathuram Godse was a Hindu extremist, and he murdered Gandhi very simply because of this over here. This is the Muslim leader of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and this is Gandhi meeting with him. So Nathuram Godse and these Hindu extremists believe that because Gandhi met with this Muslim leader, he was giving credence to the idea that the Muslims deserve their own country. But what Gandhi really wanted was peace, and he was willing to get it no matter the world's circumstances. Nathuram Godse came into Gandhi's ashram. Gandhi at the time was in his late 70s, I believe. And he was pretending to go and pray with him and then shot and murdered him and killed him. Today, Gandhi's ashes are in his ashram. In fact, this is the very spot where he was assassinated. But his ashes are also spread throughout many other places. In fact, you can go to LA and there's a small portion of his ashes. The funeral that was held for Gandhi would prove to be one of the largest funerals in the world. People from all across Pakistan, India, world leaders. George C. Marshall, who you guys know from Marshall Plan fame, went to Gandhi's funeral. So, a real testament to his power and popularity. This is just a regular guy who decided to sort of, develop these ideas. And because he taught them to those around him and gained enough followers, he would become probably the greatest symbol of peace, civil disobedience, and nonviolence in history. I want to point something out. This is 1948. So every time you hear about acts of civil disobedience after 1948, it's impossible to talk about them without thinking about the impact of Gandhi. And that goes for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And that goes for every other movement that used civil disobedience. He was highly influential throughout all of those places. Now that India and Pakistan are independent countries, they have a whole host of conflicts. They still have religious conflicts between Muslims and Hindus. That's still a serious issue. In fact, Indira Gandhi, who's an ancestor not of Gandhi, but of Jawaharlal Nehru, who's the first female prime minister of India, she was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. Sikhs thought that they were going to have less rights and opportunity in a Hindu majority country. They still deal with incredible overpopulation. They have over 1 billion people in their country. That overpopulation obviously leads to incredible famine and poverty. So these are still issues that both India and Pakistan face today. Especially in India, there is still great social inequality because of the caste system. You can watch videos of people today on trains beating and kicking people off the train because they're untouchables. They're in the lowest caste, and they oftentimes won't use their fists to punch them because they don't want to touch them. They'll use the bottom of their shoes and kick them. So the caste system is still the cause of vast inequality. There continues to be issues with child marriage. Obviously, Gandhi is a product of child marriage. He was married at 13, but people have been known to be married as young as 9 years old, and this is a very serious issue. And some people would consider it a human rights issue because obviously the children don't really have any choice when they're being married. The last thing is that both India and Pakistan today have developed nuclear weapons. And India and Pakistan, because of this long history of conflict between the Muslims in Pakistan and the Hindus in India, continue to be enemies. And so there's been real fear that these two countries, even though their history has been a history of nonviolence, civil disobedience, and peace, there's been some serious issues and serious concerns that these two countries might be the two countries to actually start a nuclear war. What does that say about Gandhi's legacy? What does that say about Gandhi's successes and failures? Well, Gandhi helped to achieve Indian independence and to a lesser extent Pakistani independence. And he gave people a way out. He absolutely gave people a way out of crazed violence. He gave people a way to solve problems using their own self-control and nonviolent techniques that continue to be used to this day. That said, it's hard to say that he really fixed India. All of these issues clearly illustrate that the problems that India faced during Gandhi's time and that he fought to try and overcome are still issues today. Thank you guys for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Make sure you answer all your Edpuzzle questions, and have a good day.